Welcome back to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith, and today I'm bringing you my thoughts on Rebecca Levine's Hollow Gods series. This series and I go way back to when I was originally starting book blogging and I was scrounging the mediocre fantasy selection at my local library trying to find anything I wanted to read, and there I found the first two books. So when Hodder and Stoughton reached out to me to say, do you want a copy of the third one that's just come out, I said, yes, of course, I would love that. Thank you very much. I do have a review for just this book on my blog and I will link that below, but I thought it would be a bit weird to make a review just for the third book, given that I've never mentioned the series before on my channel, except in wrap-ups and things, so I thought I would discuss the whole of the Hollow Gods series so far. So yes, usual disclaimers, I was sent a copy of the third book, The Sun's Devices, which is what you will see behind me being representative. I bought books 1 and 2 on Kindle in order to reread them, ready for this video, but I got them from the library originally. Regardless of where I got the books from, nobody's paying me to talk about books, all opinions are my own. I'm also going to talk vaguely about all 3 books, but I'm going to keep things spoiler-free as much as I can. If you want to go in knowing absolutely nothing, click away now. So far there are 3 books in the Hollow Gods series. Book 1, The Smiler's Fair, released in 2014, and the follow-up, The Hunter's Kind, came out in 2015. Now, that's a 5-year gap between those 2 books and this last one. While the series isn't marketed as grimdark, it's marketed as epic fantasy, I think it has a lot of grimdark elements to it, a lot of these kind of morally ambiguous characters. I think it leans more into having some characters who at least believe they are completely good heroes. So maybe a dark-leaning epic fantasy. I will say before we go in though, there are some scenes that I think some readers would probably find upsetting, and I'd say read these at your own risk, I guess, but if there's anything really specific you want to know about, feel free to drop me an email. Rebecca Levine is a sci-fi horror fantasy author, TV storyliner, editor. She's done all of the things. She's also worked on the storyline for the Zombies Run app, which I thought was really interesting. Plot summary. This is a multiple POV epic fantasy series, so it would be quite hard to snappily wrap up all of the different plot threads in a easy to digest segment. The main story focuses on a young boy called Krish who grows up in the mountains with this horrible father. His life changes when it's revealed to him that he is in fact the son of the king and the moon god reborn, and he was supposed to be killed at birth, but he was smuggled out by his dying mother and raised adopted in the mountains. The revelation that Krish is alive, the moon god is alive, sets quite a lot of different plot threads in motion. Everyone from warriors to sex workers to princesses, everyone's life is affected by this news, and all their paths will cross at the Smiler's Fair. I feel like an epic fantasy series needs to have at least one interesting thing in the setting to get my attention. I just feel like I've read too many things where the setting was just medieval Europe but fantasy. There's no problem with that in principle. I've read some really good books that are like that, but I think there's a really good opportunity to, with a fantasy world, to create a completely new culture. In this case, we have a world populated by people who at one point in their history came over to the land on these enormous ships. And on top of that, the world is such that if a place is dark for too long, the worm men, who are the servants of the moon god, will turn up and kill people. So what that means is that we have a settlement that is constantly on the move, both as a tribute to the seafaring past and also to avoid the worm men. It's not quite as industrial as the moving cities of Mortal Engines, but we do have these huge settlements that are having to be shifted around the side of a lake, for example. Those larger settlements come into play much more in later books and in the later part of the first book, but they definitely caught my eye as an interesting setting tidbit. I also thought that the variety between characters was really good. We have very different point of view characters, and what Levine manages to do well is capture their different voices. Is there anything worse than a multiple POV book where you can't work out which character you're reading? But Levine manages to get that across, get the different voices of the characters, their levels of education, their interests, their backgrounds, all through their written voice. I won't say I loved every single perspective in this book. This was definitely one of those series where there were a couple of characters I was very interested in, and everyone else I was kind of, I'll get through you to get to my other characters. It's probably worth noting here that that's also what got me through reading A Song of Ice and Fire. This series does some big stuff, some big cool stuff. There are big battles, big magical things, big settings. It all feels very large scale, and you definitely get the sense of the characters' actions having ramifications. I think it helps that a lot of the plot threads are very large scale, and a lot of things don't come together till later, so you have this kind of domino effect. So if that's your epic fantasy jam, then read on, my friend, read on. I will say some things go to some really weird places, but again, maybe that's what you're interested in. This isn't exactly a con, I guess, if we've done the pros, but more something to keep in mind. The first 2 books certainly are incredibly sex-focused. So much so that it kind of distracted me from the actual story the first time I read them. Now let's think back to which sex-focused fantasy was going on at around about the same time as these were being published. Now, I'm not suggesting that every single fantasy book that published while Game of Thrones was airing was like this, and maybe comparing the two is overselling things slightly. But it's really interesting comparing the two now, especially considering that we're now 5 years on, and book 3 does have less of an emphasis on whipping it out every 5 minutes. No, I'm not going to clutch my pearls and whine about how every single book that features anyone doing anything remotely sexual is of the devil, because it isn't. I'm also not the person to decide whether this is a good or bad representation of sex work. But if that is something that you like to keep in mind when choosing an epic fantasy read, there you go, I've given you the information. There's so much banging in this series. So much banging. I also think that there's an imbalance between the 3 books. So book 1 and 2 feel very similar. Unsurprisingly, they came out very close to each other. And I don't know whether it's purely the fact that there is such a distance between those two in this book and my reading of them, or whether genuinely this book is just quite different. The plot is the same, the characters are the same, we're following the same storyline, but the tone of the book feels much lighter. There isn't that emphasis on banging. So for me, while I liked the tone of the 3rd book a bit more, I thought the story, having reread all of them, was much less strong. It just didn't have quite the same impact as the first 2 did. Something to bear in mind if you're planning on picking up this series. I was trying to think of what epic fantasy to compare this to, and really I have to fall back on the epic fantasy that I always recommend. I think that in terms of the characters who think themselves heroes and kind of toying with the idea of chosen ones, I thought the Poppy War would be a really good series, and you should just read that anyway, so I shall recommend it every chance I get. And equally, Chorus of Dragons would be a great option. Again, this epic fantasy chosen one stuff. Good times. I thought about maybe Priory of the Orange Tree, but I think that's just my brain associating 2 orange covers. I actually really did enjoy reading this series. I think it was really interesting for me to see how my tastes have changed and how my reading has changed over the last 5 years. No, I read them in 2017, 3 years or something like that. I wouldn't necessarily say everyone should jump out of bed, buy copies of these and read them immediately, but I do think that for some people these will be really enjoyable. I just think there's less crossover appeal than other books that I might recommend. Overall, this is a good story and an interesting world, and really what more do I have to ask for from fantasy? Okay, quite a lot of things, but shh. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was of use if you are planning on reading these books, or if you were at all interested in them, or if you'd never heard of them before. Now they are on your radar. Comment below with your epic fantasy recommendations, or a series that you just thought had too much banging in it. I want to know. You can also, while you're down there, follow me on all of my social media. That's all linked below. You can subscribe. It makes me feel loved and appreciated. That's all from me, and I will see you in the next one. There's gonna be some bloopers now. This series and I go way back, all the way to zombies run. Oh, this chair.